and I like what Christine was saying then. Amongst all the mirth we had when Bill was putting on his French and English accents and reading out those quotes, they are terribly sad. They did have a very big impact on the world. And you can imagine that if there was no Christian influence in those centuries, what the world might have been like for women. It would have been a lot worse. And we'll look at other worldviews next week, such as Islam and a little bit on Buddhism and what they teach about the role of women, just so we get a more rounded view about the influence of Christianity compared to the others. So I just want to hark back. Someone told me the real reason why the peacock's tail wasn't particularly attractive to some of those females that Takahashi watched for 7 years with 268 matings. It was pointed out to me that females never like a show-off. And so that's the obvious reason. Yeah. It was also pointed out to me that some of you were pulling faces when I was talking about Sigmund Shlomo Freud, because there's a very funny photo up there that I forgot to mention. So not only did Sigmund Freud have a huge influence on life and literature, he had a big influence on art, and in particular surrealism. And the picture up there is a self-portrait by Salvador Dali, and he really did look a bit like that. He used to walk around Paris with a pet ocelot, which is a wild cat from South America called Baboo. And one of his paintings is called The Flight of the Bee Around a Pomegranate a Second Before Waiting. And he particularly talks about how that relates to Sigmund Freud's teachings. So that whole branch of art, surrealism, once regarded their patron father or patron saint as Sigmund Freud. So a big influence on the world in lots of ways. Okay, we're going to look at a much more cheerier subject now, and that is, well, in what ways has Jesus worked to elevate the status of women using women? I thought this would be a really interesting study. I'm looking more at that 1800s and 1900s early part, because that's what we've been talking about, the strong forces that were opposed to women at that stage. These strong atheistic views, this evolutionism that was around, which makes these women stand out even more. So the first woman we're going to look at is a lady called Maria Stuart. I'd be interested to know, with a show of hands, has anyone heard of Maria Stuart before? 1, 2. Well done. That's great, Hazel. Did you read about her, or is there a film about her that I should know about? No, you just read about her. Okay. Okay, thanks. So Maria Stuart, she was born in 1803 to free African-American parents in Hartford, Connecticut. So Connecticut's a state between Boston and New York. 1803 is when she was born to these free Afro-Americans, husband and wife. Unfortunately, when she was 5 years old, she became an orphan. So she became an indentured servant for 10 years. That was her prescribed time. So for 10 years, she was an indentured servant. It seems that in that time, she self-taught to read and write, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But she certainly was reading and writing, it would seem, at the end of that. When she was 20, she started going to Sunday school or Sabbath schools. And that's when her education, they say, really increased. And certainly her love for Jesus was very strong. Keep in mind her circumstances, won't you? She was a black woman who was an orphan, had been an indentured servant during her early teenage years, and now she's a lover of Jesus. 23 years of age, she marries. Great story, isn't it? 26 years of age, he dies, so 3 years later. Sad story. Particularly sad because they say some white people prohibited her from having any inheritance from the black man that she was married to. That's pretty hard times. So she's 26. She's born 1803, so you do the maths, it's 1829, isn't it? What was happening in the world in 1829 to black people? So in 1807, in the UK, an act was passed for the abolition of slave trading, not the abolition of slavery. That was in the UK. What was happening in America, where she was? 1807, they passed a law for the abolition of the importation of slaves. That's quite different, isn't it? It was poorly enforced. They say about another 50,000 slaves were taken to America after 1807. It didn't prohibit domestic slave trading, so you could buy and sell your slaves within America. It didn't prevent you from getting slaves from other countries and selling them to other countries. So life was still pretty difficult. 1833 was when Wilberforce in the UK got the Anti-Slavery Act passed, the abolition of slavery, 3 days before he died. But that's in the UK. The Civil War in America didn't happen to 1861. So not easy times for young Maria Stuart. But what does she do? So keep in mind, it was 1829, lost everything, hasn't she? She hasn't got much. But she gives a lecture in 1831, and she introduces herself as a convert to Jesus, someone who's given themselves to Jesus. She gives a lecture to a group of women. We'll come back to that. Next year in 1832, she gives a lecture to it was called AFRIC, not African, African-American Female Intelligence Society of America. So an all-women's audience. This is regarded by some people as the first ever lecture given by an American-born woman at all. We have no previous records of an American woman giving a lecture earlier than Maria Stuart. Pretty amazing, isn't it? She said at that second talk, and as I said, I come across conflicting records about which talk was first and whatever, but this second talk to the African-American Female Intelligence Society of America, she said that she was commanded by God to speak. And you can read this speech. It's powerful stuff. You know, it's really strong. It just reads and resonates. Yes, you can imagine an Afro-American woman speaking this today. It was really strong. She didn't mince her words. So that was 1832. Later in 1832, she gave a lecture to a promiscuous audience. What was a promiscuous audience? It consisted of men and women who were black and white. She's recorded as the first American woman to have ever spoken to a mixed audience. And yet she had such humble beginnings. She often quoted the Bible in her talks. She had leaflets published. She loved Jesus. What did she talk about? She talked about how the women needed to change their daughters, change their sons, that they had to honour God in the way they lived. She was trying to bring up the status of women. That's what she was about, anti-slavery, but also the rights of women. So it's way back then, all because of Jesus and the Bible. It doesn't seem true that the Bible could be misogynist when this woman is motivated by what it says. So if we move on a bit to 1890, let's go to a different part of the world, let's go to India. There was an American missionary, Dr. Nancy Mansell. I can't find a lot more about who she was and her upbringing, unfortunately. But in 1890, she was a medical missionary in India. And she was abhorred by the mortality rate, the death rate of child brides. So what did she do? She got a petition together, and she successfully petitioned the Indian government to raise the minimum age of marriage to 12. Now, that might not seem a lot to you, but it was a big achievement back then, a huge achievement, and it would have come at considerable risk. 1891, let's come back closer to home. Put your hand up if you've ever heard of the temperance movement. Okay, it was all about trying to treat alcohol as a banned drug. And of course, there's the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Put your hand up if you know about them. A couple of you. I grew up knowing about them. I had an idea that they were Christian and that they were just about liquor and trying to ban liquor. And usually reference was made to them in a very demeaning, belittling way. But in 1891, what did the Women's Christian Temperance Union do? Together with some other societies, they got a petition together. And they got 30,000 signatures on this petition, which they presented to Parliament. It was all glued and stuck together, and it was 260 metres long. Talk about making a statement. So, pretty impressive. And what was it calling for? Was it calling for the banning of alcohol? It was calling for the right for women to vote. Do you know they were very active in other domains? They were very active in equal pay for equal work. They were very campaigning for the rights of women and education. And what was their name? The Women's Christian Temperance Union. Their constitution said that their standards are those from the Holy Bible. It's pretty strong and pretty overt, isn't it? So that was 1891. Let's move on and go over to another part of the world now. We're going to look at a lady called Amy Carmichael. Some of you might have heard of her. Can you put your hand up if you have? Yeah, say it again. Yeah, Donover. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So Amy Carmichael was born in Belfast in 1867. And she became a Christian when she was 18 years of age. Her father had already died. And what does she do? She's only 18. She's not had any formal Bible education. She notices that there are these shawlies all over the place. Who are shawlies? Shawlies are girls who were too poor to wear a hat. So all they had was a shawl. And they worked in the mills. And she loved these girls. And people actually talked about them living in the slum in Belfast. So she wasn't super impressed with the way the churches were reaching out to these girls. So, of course, she started a church. It was a tin tabernacle at one stage, and that's an interesting side of the story. But it was eventually called the Welcome Church, and it read on a welcoming sign, because it was a welcome church, that's what it was called, "Come one, come all, come in your work clothes." It was really pulling to these girls, really attractive to these girls. And eventually she had a congregation of 500. That's pretty amazing for a teenager. Yeah, I sometimes think we hold back our teenagers too much that have a love for Jesus. So anyway, that was 1867 she was born. We talked about when she was 18. So in about 1925, I've got a date up there. 1895, thank you. So in 1895, she'd already been a missionary to Japan. And she had been very influential in helping people to get to know Jesus. So huge numbers of Japanese had become Christians through her ministry. But she felt called to India. So off she goes to India, as you can see, in 1895. In India, she continued her evangelical work. Remember, she's there because she's got a love for Jesus. She's got this great love for the Bible. And one day, she meets a 7-year-old girl. Now, this girl was called Preena. Now, Preena was a Devadasi. We talk about a diva today, a goddess. A Devadasi was a servant of the Hindu temple. She was a temple prostitute. So Preena was a 7-year-old temple prostitute. She had already tried to escape once and succeeded in escaping. She got all the way back to her mum. Her mum was very afraid because she was very well aware of the power of the Hindu spirits. So the mum took her back to the Hindu temple. The temple people weren't very impressed that the 7-year-old had run away, and they branded with hot irons her hands. So you'd think that would have been enough, but it wasn't. So she escaped a second time, and this time she went to a church. And there a woman took her to Amy Carmichael. And Preena and Amy Carmichael formed a strong bond. Now, Amy Carmichael, with the help of her Accals, A-C-C-A-L-S, that meant sisters apparently. You can see one of them called Ponamal up there. Over time, they rescued girls from a variety of circumstances to the number of 1,000. Now, Amy Carmichael, remember, was a single girl still. She decided that she wouldn't get married. She wanted to be a single girl. She'd had no formal Bible education. What's motivating her? What's empowering her? It's her love for these girls because she has a love for Jesus. Remember, she was a strong evangelist. She wasn't just a social worker. She never took furlough. She never went back. She died in India. That's how strong and powerful her love was. And keep in mind the risks. Preena came to her in 1901. The court case over these girls being taken from the Hindu temples didn't finish till 1914. So for 13 years, there was a court case hanging over her head. Do you think the men in the towns would have been happy that they'd lost one of their prostitutes? In fact, losing lots of them? Do you think they were just going to sit there idly by? No. It was a very dangerous thing for her and her girls to do. But did they shirk? No. What gave her bravery? She was just an Irish girl. What did she do to identify with these people? When she went to India, she learnt the Tamil language. She dyed her skin brown with coffee bags. She wore their clothes, and she told them the message of Jesus. That's what the Jesus of the Bible does. So how hard it is to believe people when they say that Christianity was the worst thing that ever happened to women because it's so misogynist. So I hope I've given you some inspiration there. There's still a lot of work to be done. The 9 out of 10 Devadasis today are aged less than 10. 5,000 to 10,000 girls become Devadasis each year in India. There's about 250,000 Devadasis between India and Nepal, they say. And there are still Christian girls who go to the Devadasis and befriend them and tell them about Jesus and try to show them a different life. Perhaps you can help them. We still have infanticide, where people preferentially kill girls. So I've got a book here, A Heart for Freedom, an autobiography by Chai Ling. So she set up a group called All Girls Allowed, and she talks about how in China, in 2012, there was 18 million more boys aged less than 15 than girls. And yet there is normally 105 girls born for every 100 every 100 boys born. Where have all the girls gone? Well, one-child policy is only part of the answer. The other answer, of course, is they selectively kill the girls. Just like in biblical times, they would expose the infants and kill them. That's what was going wrong when Christians were formed by Jesus. All the cultures around them were just leaving babies to be exposed and die. It's called infanticide. And typically girls are what's preferentially left outside to die. So even in China today, it's still a big problem. So there's still lots of work to do for men and women who love Jesus to help the status of women in the world today. I wonder where you'll end up. I wonder where your children will end up at the 18 years of age. It's amazing to think about how powerful our God is. We're not going to talk about Islam and Buddhism tonight. We're not even going to talk about the biological differences between the brain and what evolutionary studies of animals teach us about the way men and women should be. Of course, it's 10 to 9. So how about we finish in prayer? Oh, Jesus, you've blessed our socks off. We live in such a rich town, such a rich country, such a peaceful country. So many of us you've blessed, Jesus, because you've forgiven us. Just like Chai Ling, you forgave her for killing the babies in her womb over time. You forgive us too, Jesus. Just like you've invaded her life, you took over her life upon her request and forgave her. Take over our lives, Jesus, and forgive us. Empower us to make an impact on this world and to help this world be more of a reflection of the way it ought to be and the way it used to be. We love you, Jesus. Amen. Thank you.